What is up, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Lovely Loners. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Ferrum Forge Mordax. This knife is coming to me from my friend Francisco, and I'm super stoked to be able to check it out. And there's a lot of interesting things about this knife that I'm excited to talk to you guys about. So let's just jump right in. The first thing to do here is a size comparison with the PM2. So let's get that loaded up for you guys. So you can see they are just about the same length. The Mordax is a ever so slightly tiny bit shorter in length than the PM2 is, but you do get a little bit more cutting edge out of that. As you can see there is more cutting edge to the Mordax, but not by too much. So they're pretty comparable in terms of size, although I think the Mordax in the hand feels a little bit more, not necessarily smaller, but the PM2 definitely feels like a really big knife. You've got this huge section of handle that's not being used unless you choke up on the knife, which leaves a good amount of handle down here. Whereas on the Mordax, you know, you still have a chunk up here that you're not touching unless you're choked up, but it's not quite as big of a region. I'm much further up on the blade stock on the Mordax than I am on the paramilitary. So let's get that out of the way and go ahead and jump into the features and flaws. There's a couple of things to note on this knife before we get started, which is that it has been modified. So the first thing is that this has a ceramic bearing upgrade, and it also has an aftermarket clip. Those of you who are familiar with the Ferrum Forge knives will know that they typically do just like a generic spring clip, a titanium spring clip. And this one, oh, geez, that was loud. This one has the 3D milled clip, which you can see is pretty chunky. But it actually functions really well. This is a one-hander in and out of the pocket. I was really appreciative of this clip. I really like it. I think the blue is a little bright in terms of matching kind of the navy that you have on the presentation side, but it still looks good. And it does not take finger oils very well. So you can see here, it looks kind of cloudy. And I did have it wiped off before I started the video, but I've already touched it. But you can see if we give it a quick wipe with a microfiber cloth, it gets really electric. And it's actually quite bright and shiny when it doesn't have the hand oils on there. So I really like this clip. It's pretty sweet. And in terms of my notes, the first thing that I want to talk about is that just how much I love the clip and the fact that it is legitimately a one-hand clip. You guys hear me talk about this a lot, whether or not it takes one or two hands to get a clip in and out of the pocket. You know, I'm sure most of us are familiar, especially with the milled clips, using two hands to get a knife in and out of the pocket, which is fine. I don't necessarily find anything particularly wrong with that. A clip is only poor to me when it doesn't really fit around the pants, or if like there's a texture under the clip that makes it so that you're kind of chewing away at your pants. I don't like that. But when a 3D milled clip, or really any clip, is legitimately easy, passes over the pant pocket with just one hand and doesn't tug, and just kind of glides over and is secure in your pocket, I always have a lot of appreciation for that, and that is definitely being represented here with this third-party clip. So I can't really speak to how the normal Mordax spring clip is going to function, but I can tell you that this aftermarket clip is fantastic. Now moving on, I will say that this this flipper tab here needs serious work. I have pretty slippery hands. I don't always have super dry hands, and so this I slip over this absolutely constantly. You can see here it's at a pretty steep angle. There's no jimping. It's all smooth and rounded off, and it's basically designed for you to not be able to use it. So if I was going to own one of these knives, I would have to get aftermarket jimping done to the flipper tab, but I would really like Ferrum Forge to honestly just reverse the shape of this flipper and put this kind of hooked curve up at the top so that I actually had something to grip on, because I slip on this flipper tab more than I slip on any other flipper tab of any knife I've ever used. It does have a fairly strong detent, which is adjustable, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the deployment on the knife is not so great if you loosen up the detent. So to get both amazing deployment and have this flipper tab, it doesn't work so well. There's plenty of times where I slide right over this thing. And even when my hands are like really, really dry, I still have an issue with it. So that's my biggest gripe with this knife, and actually the one thing that's kept me from buying one for myself. When I first pulled this thing out of the box, getting it from Francisco, I was super excited. I thought it looked super cool, and then I flipped it, and I was like, oh wow, I really like that deployment. And I was like, this might actually be a knife that I need in my collection. And then upon playing with it more and kind of going after this flipper tab, I realized that unless I really seriously want to consider getting this modified, this knife simply doesn't work for me. It will not function in my collection for that exact reason. So I strongly urge you guys to really take that into consideration when you're considering this or any other Ferrum forged knife. If you have really beat up fingers that are always dry and kind of grippy themselves, then you might not have as much of an issue as I do. But like, I'm trying to open the knife there, and you can see I just slipped 4 times in a row, and it just does not work well for me. So that's something that seriously needs to be considered when you're looking at this or any other similarly designed Ferrum forged knife. Moving on to the next thing, I really dislike this kind of bulgy lock side of the pivot. You can see here, it sticks out pretty far. So they have this really beautiful, anodized or otherwise colored pivot screw on the presentation side here, and that looks really great. And then you flip it over, and there's this giant knob sticking out of the side of the knife. And I really want you guys, looking at this and seeing how it's kind of raised, I want you guys to get perspective on how far this thing is really sticking out. It just kind of seems ugly to me. It doesn't really affect the way the knife sits because it's already sitting on the clip, which is fine. But I don't know, something about that, I just saw it and was like, why? Why does it have to be so thick? Why can't it just be a flatter, I don't know if it's you can't unscrew it or anything, but I don't understand why this has to be so bulgy. It just kind of, the whole knife is extremely smooth, and then you have this giant thing sticking out. That really didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It's a small gripe, and of course, when you're looking at knives in this price point, they're pretty stellar as knives, so it becomes a little nitpicky to find things that are quote-unquote wrong with the knife, but this was something that I just didn't understand as a design element. It seemed off to me. The next thing I want to talk about is the way the knife feels in the hand, and kind of going from my least favorite feature, which was the flipper tab, this is actually my favorite feature. So this knife feels so good in the hand, and it has a few really excellent grips. So if we hold the knife down here like this, it's going to do pretty well. So you can see here, there's a bit of an area for my index finger to feel nice and comfortable. There's plenty of room here on this knife. I wear about a medium glove. I'm on the small side of a medium glove. So smalls are usually too small and mediums are a bit long on my fingers. I have short, chubby fingers, but that gives you an idea of how big my hand is. And this is just about a great size. There's room here for just about another half finger. This is about 1 centimeter in length. So you're going to have space for a bigger hand for sure. But it's got a nice kind of slight curve here. It's got a nice straight back. It's going to fill the hand very well. It's a fairly thick knife, these 2 giant slabs of titanium. So it's very filling in the hand, which I can definitely appreciate. But then you have this awesome finger choil. And I don't know about you guys, I'm a big fan of usable finger choils. I believe the Bodega has a pretty solid one as well. It's not quite as dramatic on the Bodega, but I always like on big knives being able to choke up. I think that's a really important thing because when a knife is this big, you want a few different ways to be able to get control of it so that you feel comfortable doing big, slicey tasks like this, or kind of little more fine tasks when you need to get in somewhere a little bit smaller. So I really appreciate this finger choil, and the shape of the flipper tab does a really good job, if you can see here, does a really good job of kind of cradling the finger, and the index finger just fits so well in this finger choil, and so I'm super appreciative of that. And then the area where your index finger normally is works very well with your middle finger, of course your middle finger being the longest finger, and this is going to allow me to make contact with my hand and have an extraordinarily controlled grip over the knife. So I really appreciate this, and it fits really well in the hand. There's no jimping on the spine of the blade. You can see it's actually pretty thin. This swedge is pretty aggressive, and so you're a little slippery up here, but it doesn't quite matter so much because you have such a controlled, strong grip around the knife. So I really appreciate this. This knife has a very strong, sturdy construction, and that is kind of mirrored in the way that it feels in the hand based on the design. So I'm super appreciative of that, and that's probably my favorite feature of the knife. I really like it. And then talking about the construction a little bit more, the knife is a little bit weighty. There's no internal milling in these giant slabs of titanium. Now, it's not too heavy. I wouldn't call this a particularly over heavy knife. I wouldn't even necessarily go so far as to call it overbuilt, although it is pretty much on that line. It's riding that line of overbuilt. But the knife isn't too heavy, but it definitely you feel it. And it's kind of interesting. The blade is pretty chunky, and the blade just about weighs as much as the handle here. You can see it has pretty fair balance. I don't want to drop the knife. Pretty fair balance, but it's a little bit north of the index finger groove here. So it's actually kind of close to the finger groove. So that's pretty good balance. But yeah, it's going to be a fairly weighty knife, all things considered. But I think that's fine based on the size that it actually has. So the next thing to talk about, I mentioned the adjustable detent. This knife has the HRD, which I believe was made by Hoback. Jake Hoback is his first name, I believe. And the HRD is a detent ball that actually rolls, so it kind of reduces friction on the blade tang or at least on the detent track. And then you can also see here, you can get a little flathead screwdriver in there and actually adjust the strength of the detent. So if we go back to what I was talking about earlier, you can adjust the detent on this knife so that it's a little bit looser, but then you don't quite get that really solid deployment, that really solid lockup that I think makes this knife really enjoyable to deploy. And so I found myself cranking back up the strength of the detent despite the fact that it made it more difficult for me to deploy the knife because it made the knife feel so much better. But this is a really unique and awesome feature, and I was very appreciative of having such an easy way to tweak the strength of the detent. And I think that's really cool because on a lot of knives that I've had to do that for, you got to take the whole thing apart and adjust the lock bar and put it back together and see if that worked. And it's kind of a nightmare, and it sometimes doesn't help with the rest of the function of the knife. The knife doesn't close as well because you've cranked up the strength. So everything about this HRD here is something that I can really appreciate and wrap my head around, and I see why they did it, and I really think it adds to the knife. So this is definitely a major positive as far as the knife is concerned. And then if we talk about the action a little bit, it has a really interesting sound. It should have kind of like a meteor sound, and it doesn't, and I find that interesting, but it's very solid, and something about the sound almost feels like there's reverberation through the blade, especially when it's closed. I'll see if I can. Not sure how much of this is coming across on the microphone, but it's got a really solid sound to it. It's just a little bit different. It's not chunky or meaty like it is on some of the other more robust knives that I have. But it is a pretty great sound, and I do really like deployment on this knife. You can see here, it drops closed very smoothly with just ever so slight movement. So not quite under its own weight, but extraordinarily close. And this does have the ceramic bearing upgrade. Please keep that in mind. So it's very, very smooth, and when you get that rock solid deployment, it feels really great, and it has an excellent action. But again, if we go back to the lack of jimping on this, you only get that sweet deployment if you manage to hit that flipper tab correctly, which is something that I fail to do quite frequently. So this knife is really a toss-up for me, guys. I was super enamored with it when I first pulled it out of the package, and the initial thoughts that I had were all very positive, and I was like, wow, this knife actually feels a lot better than I kind of expected it to. I've seen a lot of videos and clips and stuff of the different Ferrum forged knives, and they didn't quite seem up to the standard that I had, just in terms of, I don't even really know how to describe it. Just kind of the overall knife. I really wasn't sure about it. And so when I first opened it up, I was like really stoked. And I was like, wow, this really blows me away. I really love the construction. I particularly love this anodization and this milling that they have done on the frame here. Now, of course, that's entirely subjective. So That one was a little bit more personal, but I just really liked everything about it, and I was really surprised, and I started thinking, wow, I'm going to have to find one of these for myself. And then the more that I flipped it and the more that I dealt with this, and the more that I noticed some weird, interesting quirks, and just really just this flipper tab, I realized that this one's not quite going to cut it for me, just in those terms. Now, I did talk to the owner and some other people, and I seem to be having more of an issue with the flipper tab than others, and I really think that's just due to my wet palms. And that's totally fair. I get it. If that's not an issue for you, then you might not have nearly as many problems with this knife, and so that's great. And so I'm definitely supportive of the action here and the construction. I think it's a really great knife. It's just that the flipper tab didn't work out for me so well. So I would definitely be looking at adding jimping. Apparently, it's pretty common that people do that in the aftermarket, so I'm not the only one that's had that issue. But if you guys are thinking about purchasing a Ferrum forge, I could definitely recommend the Mordax. I think it's a sweet knife, and even though it wasn't for me, it has a lot of qualities that I think are really important and really positive, particularly the HRD. I love this clip, even though it's aftermarket. I think the action is fantastic. I think the way the blade closes is fantastic. I also like the stonewash on the flat grinds here, and then you have the satin flats right around this area, and I think it looks pretty good. I like that it's a giant chunky blade. It's going to make a really great slicer. This thing's going to slice through anything you put in front of it. It's got a nice flat section here for cutting tasks like cutting through cardboard, and then you've got a fair amount of belly up here. Great point for piercing. In fact, might have just even pierced. It's very sharp. It looks not quite so sharp on video and kind of in real life, but when you poke it, it's actually extraordinarily sharp. So this is going to have a great user blade. Like I said, the knife's not quite exactly overbuilt, even though it's right on the line, which makes this a great user. I think the stonewash finish is going to take wear very well. You can see the owner has some scratches around this area, but it doesn't look so bad. You only catch it when you're really looking for it. And it definitely fades away into the knife very well. So if you're looking for a nice knife that's a little bit higher up on the price point, has a little bit of beauty kind of tacked on there with this milling and coloring and everything, but that you can still take with you on a pretty serious trip and cut through wood or cut through something that might otherwise beat up a really fancy knife of yours, I think this is a fantastic option. So definitely consider this if you are looking for something that is maybe like a flipper version of a Sabenza. Being bearings and not washers, it's not the kind of thing that you can necessarily drag through mud the same way you can drag a Sabenza through mud. But if you're looking for something that, feels really well built, it's kind of just solid titanium slabs, and just really feels good in the hand, has a lot of good ergonomics to it, and is able to get any slicing task done very well and not show wear too much, but you want it in a flipper form with maybe a little bit more eccentricity than a basic Sabenza, this is like the perfect knife for you. So I definitely recommend that. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you're interested in seeing other videos with any of the knives that you see here or other ones that I have on the way, please remember to subscribe. If you would like to send a knife or other piece of EDC gear in for a lovely loaners video, you can do so by emailing me at tovarishworks@gmail.com. Follow me on Instagram at tovarishworks as well, and I'll see you guys next time.